Intelligence agencies might have had ideological reasons to want Hammarskjöld dead. But for the mining companies operating in Katanga, the motive was simpler and more powerful: money. Billions of dollars in copper, cobalt, diamonds, and uranium. Resources they controlled through contracts with the Katangan government. Resources they would lose if the province was forced to rejoin the Congo. Union Minière du Haut-Katanga was the largest of these companies, a Belgian corporation that had effectively run Katanga as a private fiefdom for decades. They owned the mines. They controlled the transportation infrastructure. They even had their own security forces, armed and trained to protect company property. In many ways, Union Minière was more powerful than the Katangan government it supposedly answered to. When the Congo gained independence in 1960, Union Minière faced an existential threat. The new Congolese government, led by Patrice Lumumba, wanted to renegotiate the mining contracts. They wanted a larger share of the revenues. They wanted control over their own resources. This was unacceptable to a company that had spent decades extracting wealth without serious restrictions. So Union Minière supported Katangan secession. They financed Moise Tshombe's government. They hired the mercenaries who defended Katangan independence. They lobbied European governments to recognize Katanga as a separate nation. And when the UN threatened to end that secession, they had every reason to stop Dag Hammarskjöld from succeeding. The financial stakes were enormous. Union Minière's operations in Katanga generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually, equivalent to billions in today's currency. The company's stock price depended on maintaining access to these resources. Its executives, its shareholders, its home government in Belgium all had a direct economic interest in preventing Congolese reunification. Documents obtained from Belgian archives show that Union Minière executives met with Katangan military leaders in the weeks before Hammarskjöld's death. The subject of these meetings remains classified, but the timing is suspicious. Why would mining executives be meeting with military officers just before a critical diplomatic mission by the UN Secretary General? There's also evidence that Union Minière had intelligence networks that rivaled government agencies. They employed former colonial administrators who maintained relationships with local informants. They had access to communication intercepts through relationships with Belgian intelligence. They knew about Hammarskjöld's travel plans, possibly before some official agencies did. Could a corporation arrange the assassination of a UN Secretary General? The answer depends on whether you believe corporations operate within the constraints of law and morality, or whether they pursue profits by any means available when the stakes are high enough. Union Minière had already demonstrated a willingness to use violence to protect its interests. Their security forces had killed striking miners. Their mercenaries had attacked UN peacekeepers. Murder wasn't beyond their capabilities. But corporations don't usually conduct assassinations directly. They hire people for that. And in Katanga in 1961, there were plenty of people available for hire. Mercenary pilots, intelligence operatives, local militias, anyone with the skills and willingness to shoot down a plane for the right price. Following the money trail leads to interesting places. Bank records from this period are incomplete, but researchers have found evidence of large payments from Union Minière to various security contractors in September 1961. The stated purpose of these payments is protection services. The actual recipients and what services they provided remain unclear. Some of these payments went to mercenary commanders who employed pilots like Jan van Rissegem. Were they paying for general security? Or were they paying for a specific operation against a specific target? Without access to detailed financial records, which Union Minière's successor companies refused to release, we can't know for certain. What we do know is that Union Minière had motive, means, and connections to make an assassination happen. And after Hammarskjöld's death, they benefited enormously. The UN's push to reunify the Congo lost momentum. Katangan secession continued for another 2 years. Union Minière maintained control of the mines and continued extracting billions in wealth. It wasn't until 1963, after Katanga finally collapsed and rejoined the Congo, that the company began losing its grip on Congolese resources. Even then, They negotiated favorable terms that allowed them to maintain significant operations. The 2 extra years of independence they gained after Hammarskjöld's death were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Enough money to justify almost any action. Other mining companies operating in the region had similar motives. British firms like Tanganyika Concessions had major stakes in Katangan mineral resources. American companies had invested in refining operations dependent on Katangan ore. The entire Western mining industry had structured itself around the assumption that Katanga's resources would remain accessible under favorable terms. Hammarskjöld threatened that entire structure. He believed in resource nationalism, in the idea that African countries should control their own mineral wealth. He had explicitly said that the Congo's resources belonged to the Congolese people, not to foreign corporations. If he succeeded in imposing this vision, it would set a precedent for the entire continent. So the mining companies didn't just have billions at stake in Katanga specifically. They had the entire post-colonial resource extraction model at risk. If the Congo could successfully assert control over its resources with UN support, other African nations might do the same. The financial implications were staggering. This gives the corporations a motive that goes beyond simple greed. They were defending an entire economic system. A system where Western companies extracted wealth from African resources while African nations received minimal benefits. Hammarskjöld was trying to replace that system with something more equitable. And the corporations had every incentive to stop him. But corporations, like intelligence agencies, benefit from plausible deniability. They wouldn't want to be directly linked to an assassination. They would need intermediaries, mercenaries who could be disavowed, intelligence contacts who could arrange things without official corporate involvement. A structure where the order to kill Hammarskjöld could pass through enough layers that no one could trace it back to the boardrooms in Brussels or London. This is where the conspiracy gets complicated. Because if mining companies wanted Hammarskjöld dead, and if intelligence agencies had their own reasons to want him dead, and if mercenary pilots were willing to do the actual killing, you end up with a situation where everyone has motive but no one has sole responsibility. The perfect conspiracy. One where the truth is distributed across so many parties that uncovering it requires unsealing archives from multiple countries and corporations. And that's exactly what hasn't happened. The mining companies won't release their files. The governments won't release their intelligence records. The mercenaries who knew the truth are dead. What remains is a web of connections and motives, all pointing toward the same conclusion but none providing definitive proof. Yet the financial motive is the most straightforward part of this mystery. Someone stood to lose billions if Hammarskjöld succeeded. Someone stood to gain billions if he died. In any investigation, you follow the money. And in this case, the money trail leads directly to the mining companies of Katanga. Whether they pulled the trigger or just paid someone else to do it, their fingerprints are all over this crime. The evidence, the suspects, the conspiracies, they all circle around the central mystery. What actually happened in the skies over northern Rhodesia on the night of September 17, 1961? To answer that, we need to reconstruct those final minutes aboard the Albertina, based on witness testimony, crash site evidence, and the few communications that survived. 10 p.m. The Albertina is approaching Ndola from the north. Captain Hallenquist has been flying for more than 5 hours. The flight has been routine, uneventful. Weather conditions are clear. Visibility is good. There's no reason to expect any problems with the landing. 10:13 p.m. Air traffic control in Ndola receives a transmission from Captain Hallenquist. He reports he's beginning his descent for landing. The controller acknowledges and prepares the runway lights. This is standard procedure. Everything is proceeding normally, and then something goes wrong. But what? If you believe Harold Julian's testimony, the first sign of trouble is an explosion. Or multiple explosions. He describes hearing loud bangs, seeing flashes of light. The aircraft shudders violently. Something has impacted the plane, possibly in the cargo hold or near the wings where the fuel tanks are located. If you believe the local witnesses on the ground, the first sign is fire. They describe seeing flames on the aircraft while it's still in the air, not after it crashes. Some mention sparks trailing from one wing. Others describe seeing the whole plane lit up as it descends. If you believe Charles Southall's account of the NSA intercepts, the first sign is a radio transmission from another aircraft. A pilot reporting he's intercepting the Albertina. A pilot saying he's achieved weapons lock. A pilot saying, "I've hit it." All three accounts point to the same conclusion. The Albertina came under attack while approaching Dola Airport. Something hit the aircraft at altitude, causing catastrophic damage. What happened next was inevitable. 10:15 p.m. The Albertina stops communicating with air traffic control. This could be because the radio was damaged, or because the pilots were too busy fighting for control to make transmissions, or because something happened to the pilots themselves. The crash site evidence suggests all three might be true. Inside the aircraft, passengers and crew would have felt the plane yaw violently to one side. If there was an explosion or weapons impact, the cabin might have depressurized. Fire could be spreading along one wing or in the cargo hold, and Captain Hallenquist would be fighting the controls, trying to maintain altitude long enough to reach the airport. He might have succeeded if the damage wasn't too severe. DC-6 aircraft are robust. They can fly with significant damage. But if the control surfaces were hit, if the hydraulics were severed, if fire reached the fuel tanks, even the best pilot couldn't save the plane. 10:16 p.m. The Albertina's nose drops. The aircraft goes into a dive. Not the steep but controlled descent of a landing approach. An actual dive, losing altitude rapidly, the angle steepening as the pilots lose control. Witnesses on the ground describe hearing the engines roar, as if someone was trying to pull out of the dive by adding power. It doesn't work. The physics are against them. Whatever damaged the aircraft has made controlled flight impossible. And they're running out of altitude. The ground is coming up fast. 10:17 p.m. The Albertina hits the forest canopy at high speed, nearly vertical. The impact is catastrophic. The fuselage breaks apart. The wings shear off. Bodies are thrown from their seats despite safety belts. The aircraft plows through trees and strikes the ground. And then the fuel explodes. The fire that might have started in the air now engulfs the wreckage. The heat is intense enough to melt aluminum, to cremate remains, to destroy evidence. This is why so many crash sites show fire damage. The impact ignites fuel. But the Albertina's fire pattern is different. Some areas show signs of burning that started before impact. Metallurgy consistent with high-temperature explosive damage rather than fuel fire. Harold Julian, by some miracle, survives. He's thrown clear of the main impact zone. His injuries are severe but not immediately fatal. He's conscious. He can move. He tries to help others but quickly realizes there are no others to help. He's the only one alive in the wreckage, and he's aware enough to understand what he experienced. He remembers the explosions. He remembers the fire. He remembers those final moments before impact. This is the testimony he'll try to give over the next 6 days. This is the truth that will be dismissed and ignored and suppressed. But while Julian lies in the wreckage, something else is happening. If the local witnesses are to be believed, vehicles are approaching. Armed men are arriving at the crash site long before the official rescue teams. They have flashlights. They're searching the wreckage. They're looking for something. Are they looking for survivors to help or survivors to silence? Are they looking for evidence to preserve or evidence to remove? We know that by the time official teams arrive 15 hours later, Hammarskjöld's briefcase is gone. We know that certain documents are missing. We know that the scene has been disturbed in ways that suggest more than just crash violence. What we don't know is who these early visitors were. Were they mercenaries ensuring their attack was successful? Intelligence operatives securing classified material? Company security removing evidence of corporate involvement? All of the above? By dawn on September 18th, the crash site tells a story. But it's not the whole story, because the crucial evidence, the testimony of the pilots, the flight data recorder, the intact aircraft systems, is destroyed. What remains is wreckage that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Pilot error if you want to believe in accidents. Sabotage if you're looking for conspiracy. And just enough ambiguity that no investigation can reach a definitive conclusion. This is the genius of the attack if it was an attack. Choose a method that looks like it could be an accident. Strike when the aircraft is on approach where pilot error is most plausible. Destroy the evidence in the fire. Remove any materials that might provide proof. And let investigators fill in the gaps with the conclusion that's most convenient. But the attackers made one mistake. They didn't count on Harold Julian surviving long enough to talk. And while his testimony was fragmented and ultimately suppressed, it was enough. Enough to ensure that 65 years later, people are still asking questions. Enough to ensure that the official story never quite satisfied anyone who looked closely at the evidence. The Albertina fell from the sky at 10:17 p.m. on September 17, 1961. Why it fell remains the question that haunts the United Nations to this day. And the answer, if it exists, is locked in archives that span 3 continents, controlled by governments and corporations who have every reason to keep it hidden. When crash investigators examine bodies recovered from an aircraft disaster, they're looking for specific patterns of injury: blunt force trauma from impact, burns from post-crash fire, wounds consistent with being thrown against structures inside the cabin. These injuries tell the story of how people died. And sometimes they tell the story of what happened before the crash. The bodies recovered from the Albertina showed all the expected injuries, except for details that didn't quite fit. Details that suggested the official narrative was missing something crucial. And one body in particular, Hammarskjöld's, showed signs that troubled forensic investigators then and continue to raise questions now. Dag Hammarskjöld was found outside the aircraft, thrown clear during the impact. His body showed severe trauma consistent with high-speed crash. Multiple fractures, internal injuries, the kind of damage you'd expect from hitting the ground at terminal velocity. This matched the official explanation: pilot error, crash, death on impact. But there were other injuries that didn't match quite so neatly. Photographs of Hammarskjöld's body, the ones that survived and weren't removed from the official record, show what appears to be a circular wound on his forehead. The wound is small, clean-edged. It doesn't look like impact trauma. It looks like something else. Modern forensic pathologists who have examined these photographs say the wound is consistent with a bullet entry point. Not definitive, the image quality is poor, the wound could have other explanations. But consistent, and troubling enough that multiple experts have recommended exhuming Hammarskjöld's body for modern forensic examination. Requests to do so have been repeatedly denied by Swedish authorities. Why? If the wound is from crash trauma, examination would confirm that and put conspiracy theories to rest. If it's something else, the world deserves to know. The fact that the examination hasn't been allowed suggests someone is afraid of what modern forensics might reveal. Then there's the matter of Hammarskjöld's positioning when found. Crash victims typically end up in positions determined by the physics of impact. Bodies are thrown in predictable directions based on where they were sitting and how the aircraft hit. But Hammarskjöld's position doesn't match these expectations. He was found on his back, arms positioned unnaturally, clothing disheveled in ways that suggest he was moved after death. Investigators noted this at the time but attributed it to the violence of the crash. Bodies can end up in strange positions after severe impacts. But rescue workers who saw Hammarskjöld's body before it was moved describe something different. They describe someone who looked like they'd been searched. Pockets turned out, jacket opened, personal items scattered around the body rather than remaining in pockets where they should have been. This matches the reports about the missing briefcase. If someone was at the crash site before the official rescue team, if they were searching for documents or intelligence materials, they would have searched the bodies as well. And Hammarskjöld, as the most important person on the plane, would have been searched most thoroughly. What were they looking for? What did they find? The official inventory of items recovered from Hammarskjöld's body is surprisingly sparse. A watch, some personal papers, his wallet, but items that should have been there, like the diplomatic credentials he would have been carrying for the meeting with Chambe, are listed as missing. either destroyed in the crash or removed by someone before the official teams arrived. The other bodies tell their own stories. Most show injuries entirely consistent with the crash. Impact trauma, burns from fuel fire, the kind of catastrophic damage you'd expect. But several bodies show pre-impact injuries, burns that occurred while the aircraft was still in flight. Wounds consistent with shrapnel or debris impact, evidence that something violent happened before the plane hit the ground. These findings appear in the medical examiner's reports but are downplayed in the official investigation. The reasoning is that flying debris during the crash sequence could have caused such injuries. Technically possible, but when combined with Julian's testimony about explosions, the pre-impact injuries take on different meaning. They become evidence of an attack rather than an accident. One crew member's body showed particularly interesting wounds. Small puncture marks in the torso, grouped in a pattern that some forensic experts have suggested resembles bullet strikes. The official explanation is that these were caused by metal fragments from the disintegrating aircraft. But the entry angles don't quite match that explanation. They're too uniform, too clustered, almost as if they came from a single source rather than random debris. That crew member's body was cremated quickly after the crash, before any independent examination could be conducted. Standard procedure for handling remains in tropical climates, according to official records. But the speed and lack of documentation raised eyebrows even at the time. When researchers later tried to examine the medical reports on this particular casualty, they found the relevant files had been misplaced from the official archive. The pattern repeats across the evidence from the bodies. Key findings that might support the murder theory are either explained away, lost, or destroyed. What remains is just ambiguous enough to allow the accident explanation to stand, while providing just enough suspicious details to fuel conspiracy theories. This is the brilliance of the cover-up, if there was one. Don't destroy all the evidence, that would be too obvious. Just destroy the most conclusive pieces. The rest can be managed through selective interpretation, by emphasizing findings that support the official story while minimizing anything that contradicts it. But you can't completely hide forensic evidence. Bodies tell stories that are hard to erase. And the bodies from the Albertina tell a story that doesn't quite match the official narrative. A story of violence before impact. A story of bodies searched after death. A story of one body in particular, the UN Secretary General's, showing wounds that might have come from a bullet. Is it proof? No. Proof would require modern forensic examination of the remains. Proof would require access to the complete medical files, including the sections that have been lost or redacted. Proof would require authorities to actually want to know the truth rather than maintain a comfortable lie. What we have instead is suggestive evidence. Enough to cast serious doubt on the pilot error conclusion. Enough to justify reopening the investigation. Enough to demand that Hammarskjöld's body be examined with modern forensic techniques. But 65 years after his death, that examination still hasn't happened. And the bodies that could tell us what really occurred on the night of September 17, 1961, have been buried with their secrets largely intact. All except for one body, the one that survived long enough to speak. Harold Julian's testimony, fragmentary and dismissed, remains the closest thing we have to the truth. A dying man's words, ignored by investigators who had already decided what they wanted to find. Among all the strange details from the Hammarskjöld crash site, one stands out for its sheer oddness. A deck of playing cards, found near the Secretary General's body. The kind of item you might carry for entertainment on a long flight. Nothing suspicious about playing cards themselves, except for one detail. The ace of spades had a bullet hole through it. A photograph of this deck exists in the official investigation files. You can see the cards scattered on the ground. You can see the hole in the ace. It's a small, clean puncture, the kind made by a high-velocity projectile passing through thin cardboard. The kind of hole made by a bullet. This single piece of evidence should have triggered immediate questions. If a bullet went through a playing card near Hammarskjöld's body, where did that bullet come from? Where did it go? Are there other bullet impacts at the crash site? Is this evidence of the attack that Harold Julian described? But those questions weren't asked. Or if they were asked, they weren't pursued. The deck of cards was photographed, catalogued as evidence, and then disappeared. When researchers tried to locate the physical cards for forensic examination in the 1990s, they were told the items couldn't be found. They'd been lost sometime in the intervening decades, misplaced during a move of evidence storage facilities. The explanation is plausible. Things do get lost, but the timing is suspicious. Because by the 1990s, modern forensic techniques could tell us a lot about that bullet hole. Analysis of the edges could determine the caliber of the bullet. Chemical tests could detect gunpowder residue. Angle analysis could show the trajectory of the projectile. All of this information could help determine whether the hole was made by a bullet fired at the aircraft from another plane or by some other means. But we can't do any of that analysis because the cards are gone. All that remains is the photograph. And while the photograph is striking, it's not definitive. Skeptics can argue that the hole might have been made by debris from the crash, or by a sharp fragment punching through during impact, or even by damage that occurred after the crash during the recovery process. These alternative explanations are possible, but they require us to believe in a very specific coincidence. That a piece of debris or a crash fragment just happened to punch a small, clean, round hole through one specific card in a deck found next to Hammarskjöld's body. That the shape and size of this hole just happens to closely resemble a bullet hole, and that this occurred in a crash where the only survivor reported hearing explosions and where witnesses reported seeing a second aircraft. The cumulative probability of all these coincidences strains credibility. The simpler explanation, that the hole was made by a bullet and that the cards were deliberately destroyed to prevent forensic examination, fits the evidence better. But simple explanations that point toward conspiracy and cover-up aren't welcomed by investigators who want to maintain the official story. There's another detail about the playing cards that deserves attention. Why was Hammarskjöld carrying them? He was traveling to a tense diplomatic negotiation. The flight was secret, conducted under a pseudonym. He had briefing materials to review, yet somehow he had time to pack a deck of cards? One theory: the cards weren't Hammarskjöld's. They belonged to someone else on the aircraft and ended up near his body after the crash through items around the cabin. This is possible, but the proximity to his body, the photograph showing them apparently in or near his personal effects, suggests they were his items. Another theory: the cards were meant as a gift. Hammarskjöld was known for small gestures of personal connection. He might have been planning to give them to Tjombe or to use them to build rapport during negotiations. This fits his character, but it doesn't explain the bullet hole. Unless the hole was made during the attack on the aircraft, unless a bullet passed through the plane's fuselage or cabin at an angle that sent it through Hammarskjöld's cards before continuing elsewhere. In which case, the cards aren't just evidence of a bullet. They're evidence of where that bullet was traveling. And that could tell us where the shooting came from. This is why the loss of the physical cards is so frustrating. Modern forensic analysis could reconstruct the bullet's trajectory based on the hole. They could tell us if the shot came from above or below, from which side, at what angle. They could potentially identify the type of weapon used. All of this information could help identify who shot down the Albertina and from where. But someone made sure that analysis would never happen. The cards were photographed, creating a record that they existed. Then they were made to disappear, ensuring they couldn't be examined. This is evidence management that serves a very specific purpose: acknowledging the existence of suspicious evidence while preventing anyone from proving what it actually shows. The same pattern appears throughout the investigation. Critical pieces of physical evidence are documented but then lost. The briefcase, photographed but never examined. Pieces of the aircraft showing possible bullet impacts, noted in reports but then misplaced from storage. Documents from Hammarskjöld's personal effects, mentioned in inventories but never actually produced. It's a cover-up technique that's almost elegant in its effectiveness. You can't be accused of destroying all the evidence because you've kept some of it. You've taken photographs, written reports, created an official record. But the physical evidence that could actually prove something definitive is always just out of reach. Lost, misplaced, destroyed by accident. The playing card with the bullet hole exemplifies this approach. We know it existed. We have the photograph. We can see the hole. But we can't examine it, can't prove what made the hole, can't use it as evidence in any meaningful way. It exists in a liminal state, real enough to fuel conspiracy theories, but inaccessible enough to prevent definitive conclusions. And that might be exactly the point. Keep the truth just visible enough that people keep looking for it. But make sure they can never quite reach it. Let the investigation continue for decades, always promising answers that never quite materialize. This serves everyone who benefits from ambiguity better than a definitive conclusion either way ever could. Because if the investigation conclusively proved murder, there would be consequences. Diplomatic fallout, demands for accountability, international scandal. But if it definitively proved accident, the truth seekers would have to accept it and move on. The current state, perpetual investigation with mounting evidence but no proof, allows the cover-up to continue indefinitely. The playing card represents this perfectly. A bullet hole we can see but can't examine. Evidence we know exists but can't access. Truth that's simultaneously visible and unreachable. It's the Hammarskjöld investigation in miniature. And like the investigation itself, it raises more questions than it answers. Questions that will remain unanswered as long as the physical evidence remains lost. Charles Southall's life changed on the night of September 17, 1961. He was a young NSA operator stationed at a listening post in Cyprus, monitoring radio communications across Africa and the Middle East. It was supposed to be a routine shift. Instead, he heard something that would haunt him for 50 years before he finally decided to speak. The NSA listening post in Cyprus was part of a global signals intelligence network. Sophisticated radio equipment capable of intercepting communications across thousands of miles. That night, Southall was monitoring frequencies used by aircraft operating in Central Africa. The Congo crisis had made this a priority assignment. Multiple intelligence agencies wanted to know what was happening in the region. Around 10:15 p.m. local time in Cyprus, the exact moment Hammarskjöld's plane was approaching Dola, Southall began picking up unusual transmissions. A pilot speaking in English with what sounded like a French or South African accent. The pilot was reporting his position, tracking another aircraft. Southall recognized this as air-to-ground communication, a pilot reporting to a control station. Then the transmissions became more urgent. The pilot reported achieving intercept position. He described maneuvering to engage. And then, clearly and unmistakably, he said, "I've hit it. There are flames. She's going down. She's crashing." Southall was stunned. He immediately understood what he'd just heard. Someone had just shot down an aircraft over Africa. And given the time, the location, and the context of ongoing operations in the Congo, there was only one aircraft it could be. The one carrying Dag Hammarskjöld. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He documented the transmission. He wrote a detailed report. He filed it with his supervisors, flagging it as critical intelligence. This was a potential act of war or terrorism or assassination. It needed immediate attention at the highest levels. What happened next is where Southall's story gets disturbing. Instead of his report triggering an investigation, it disappeared into the classified system. He was told not to discuss what he'd heard. Not with colleagues. Not with anyone outside the chain of command. The matter was being handled at levels above his clearance. Days later, when the official verdict of pilot error came out, Southall was confused. He knew what he'd heard. He knew his report contradicted that conclusion. He expected someone to come interview him to get a detailed account of the transmissions. No one ever did. Years passed. Southall left the NSA. He started a new career, but he never forgot that night. He never forgot hearing a pilot report shooting down an aircraft and then watching the world accept a story that he knew was false. And he carried that knowledge like a weight, unable to speak because of security oaths and fear of consequences. In 2011, 50 years after the crash, Southall finally decided to go public. He was elderly, retired, no longer bound by active security clearances. And he could no longer stay silent knowing that a lie was being maintained about how a UN Secretary General died. He contacted researchers investigating the case and told them everything. His testimony was explosive. Here was a trained intelligence professional with no apparent motive to lie, describing direct evidence of an aerial attack on Hammarskjöld's plane. His account corroborated Harold Julian's testimony about explosions. It matched local witnesses' descriptions of seeing fire in the sky. It provided the missing piece, confirmation that another aircraft was involved. The NSA's response to Southal's testimony was carefully calibrated. They didn't call him a liar. They didn't threaten him for breaking security oaths. Instead, they issued a statement saying they could neither confirm nor deny his account. Standard non denial. It meant they weren't going to defend the official story, but they also weren't going to admit he was telling the truth. More importantly, they refused to declassify the relevant communications intercepts from that night. Southal's report, if it still exists, remains classified. The actual recordings of the transmissions he described, the NSA would have been recording everything they intercepted, have never been released. Without access to this evidence, Southal's testimony remains credible but unverifiable. This is the pattern that repeats with every piece of evidence in this case. Someone comes forward with information. Their credibility is solid enough that dismissing them entirely would look suspicious. So instead, their testimony is acknowledged but not confirmed. And the physical evidence that could verify what they're saying is kept classified for reasons of national security. But Southall wasn't just testifying about what he heard. He was testifying about what happened to his report. And that might be even more significant, because it shows that American intelligence knew, within hours of Hammarskjöld's death, that he'd been shot down. They had an NSA operator reporting radio intercepts of the attack, and they chose to suppress that information. Why? The most innocent explanation is that they didn't want to reveal the existence of their Cyprus listening post. Signals intelligence capabilities are closely guarded secrets. Admitting they had intercepted these communications would expose operational methods. So they stayed quiet to protect sources and methods. But there are darker explanations. They stayed quiet because revealing the intercepts would raise questions about what else American intelligence knew. If the NSA was monitoring communications in that area, they might have picked up advance chatter about a plot against Hammarskjöld. They might have known about the attack before it happened. And if they knew and didn't warn anyone, that makes them complicit. Or they might have actively facilitated the attack by providing intelligence to the perpetrators. The mercenary pilot who shot down the Albertina would have needed to know Hammarskjöld's flight plan, his route, his timing. That information would have come from intelligence sources. If the NSA or CIA provided that information directly or indirectly, they weren't just passive observers. They were participants in assassination. Southall's testimony doesn't prove any of this, but it raises the questions that need to be asked. And it provides enough credible detail that dismissing it requires dismissing a career intelligence professional who has nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by speaking out. Other whistleblowers have come forward over the years with similar stories. Former military officers who saw suspicious communications. Intelligence analysts who noticed anomalies in the official timeline. Diplomats who heard rumors of Western involvement. None of them have definitive proof. All of them describe a pattern of information being suppressed and questions being discouraged. The cumulative effect of these testimonies is powerful. These aren't conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. They're professionals who were in positions to know what actually happened. And they're saying that the official story is false, that evidence was suppressed, that governments lied about what they knew. Southall died in 2014, 3 years after going public. He never got to see the evidence he described finally declassified. He never got confirmation that his report was taken seriously by anyone outside the compartmented intelligence world. But his testimony lives on as one of the most credible pieces of evidence that Hammarskjöld was murdered. And somewhere in NSA archives, the recordings of those transmissions might still exist. Proof that would verify Southall's account. Proof that would confirm the attack. Proof that American intelligence knew the truth from the beginning and helped hide it for 60 years. That proof exists, but it remains classified, and the people who control those classifications show no signs of releasing them. In any complex conspiracy, loose ends need to be managed. Witnesses who know too much, investigators who ask the wrong questions, whistleblowers who threaten to expose the truth. And sometimes, the people who become loose ends don't survive long enough to become problems. The death toll from the Albertina crash is officially 16. But if you expand the circle to include people connected to the investigation, people who had information about what really happened, the number grows. And the pattern of their deaths raises uncomfortable questions. Harold Julian was the first. The only survivor, the one witness who could have described exactly what happened in those final moments. He died 6 days after the crash from his injuries. That death appears natural, inevitable given the severity of his burns and trauma, except that he received no expert medical care until it was too late. The 15-hour delay in finding the crash site meant he spent critical hours without treatment. By the time he reached a hospital, his fate was sealed. Was this deliberate? Did someone ensure the search would take long enough that Julian couldn't survive? Or was it simply tragic bad luck that the one witness who could have blown the case open didn't get the care that might have saved him? We can't know. But the timing was certainly convenient for anyone who wanted his testimony suppressed. Then there's Jan van Rissegem, the South African pilot identified as the prime suspect in shooting down the plane. He lived for decades after 1961, working as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. Researchers tried to interview him multiple times. He consistently denied involvement but also refused to discuss the subject in detail. In 2007, just as Belgian investigators were preparing to formally question him about the crash, he died suddenly of a heart attack. Heart attacks happen. Van Rissegem was elderly. There's no evidence of foul play. But the timing meant he never had to answer questions under oath. He never had to explain the letters researchers found in his effects, the ones hinting at a mission against a UN target. He took whatever he knew to his grave, and that might be exactly what someone wanted. Bob Denard, the French mercenary commander who ran operations in Katanga, also died under convenient circumstances. He survived until 2007, long enough to become famous for staging coups across Africa. Journalists interviewed him many times about his mercenary career, but whenever the conversation turned to Hammarskjöld, Denard would shut down. He'd hint that he knew things but couldn't say. He'd suggest that the truth was more complex than anyone understood. In his final years, Denard apparently decided to write a memoir revealing everything he knew about his decades of covert operations. Publishers were interested. Researchers were excited. This could be the breakthrough that finally exposed who was behind Hammarskjöld's death. Then Denard died before completing the book. The manuscript, if it existed, was never found. His family claimed he'd never actually written anything. The memoir, like so many other pieces of evidence, vanished. Daphne Park, the MI6 officer who admitted British involvement might have occurred, also died before providing full details. After her 1992 revelation, researchers repeatedly tried to interview her. She would agree to meetings, then cancel at the last minute. She'd hint that she could say more but was bound by official secrets laws. She'd suggest that if certain documents were declassified, they would confirm her suspicions. In 2010, Park died at age 88. Shortly before her death, she allegedly told a colleague she was finally ready to tell everything she knew about Hammarskjöld. She scheduled an interview with a researcher. It was supposed to happen the week after she died. Whether she would have actually revealed anything substantial or would have maintained her pattern of hints without specifics, we'll never know. These deaths, Julian, Van Rissegem, Denard, Park, span 5 decades. They occur in different countries from different causes at different ages. There's no obvious connection, no evidence that any of them were murdered to keep them quiet. They appear to be natural deaths, the inevitable result of time passing and people aging. But the pattern is striking. Every single one of these people died either before they could testify fully or before they could reveal information they claimed to possess. Every single death occurred at a moment when their testimony could have advanced the investigation. And in every case, their potential revelations died with them. This could be coincidence.
People Dodi.
Especially people involved in events from 1961, who by the 2000s and 2010s were elderly or deceased. But intelligence agencies are patient. They know that most secrets die with the people who hold them. They know that if you can delay and obfuscate long enough, witnesses age and pass away, taking their knowledge with them. Is it paranoid to suggest that some of these deaths might have been encouraged? That intelligence services might have monitored these potential witnesses and acted when they appeared ready to talk? Or is it more paranoid to believe that all these conveniently timed deaths were just luck? There are other deaths in this story that deserve scrutiny. The Rhodesian air traffic controller who was on duty the night the Albertina crash died in a car accident in 1963. The police officer who took Harold Julian's first testimony died in what was ruled a suicide in 1965. A Belgian intelligence officer who allegedly had files on Union Minier's involvement in Katanga died in a house fire in 1967. Individually, none of these deaths prove anything. Car accidents happen. People commit suicide. House fires occur. But taken together, they form a pattern. A pattern of people who had information about the Hammarskjöld case dying before they could fully share what they knew. And while pattern doesn't equal proof, it's certainly suggestive. The counterargument is that we're seeing patterns where none exist because we want to find conspiracy. That we're taking normal deaths and imbuing them with sinister significance because it fits our narrative. That we're engaging in confirmation bias, noticing the suspicious deaths while ignoring all the witnesses who lived long lives and never revealed anything because they had nothing to reveal. This is fair criticism, and it's important to maintain skepticism about connecting dots that might not actually be connected. But it's equally important to recognize that intelligence agencies do monitor potential security risks. They do track people who might reveal classified information. And they do have the capability to make deaths look accidental when necessary. We don't need to believe that everyone who died was murdered. We just need to recognize that the pattern exists. That at multiple critical moments when the truth about Hammarskjöld's death might have emerged, the people who could have provided that truth died or disappeared. Whether by design or accident, the effect is the same. The truth remains hidden. The witnesses are silenced. And the investigation continues with ever fewer people alive who actually know what happened. As of 2026, most of the key figures in this drama are dead. The mercenary pilots, the intelligence officers, the corporate executives, the government officials, all gone. What remains are their descendants, researchers piecing together fragments, and the classified files that might contain answers. But files can't testify. Files can't be cross-examined. And files can be destroyed or kept secret forever. The pattern of convenient deaths ensures that the truth about Hammarskjöld's assassination, if it was assassination, will likely never be proven beyond doubt. Too many witnesses are gone. Too many secrets died with them. And the people who might still know something have learned the lesson. Talking about Hammarskjöld can be hazardous to your health. Even if that hazard is only the natural progression of age and mortality, the effect is the same. Silence. And secrets that remain buried with the dead. While investigators chase classified documents and interview elderly witnesses, another source of evidence sits largely untouched. The crash site itself. 9 miles southwest of Ndola, now in Zambia, the spot where the Albertina fell remains. And beneath the African soil, fragments of the truth might still be waiting. The original crash investigation examined the wreckage in 1961 using the forensic techniques available at the time. Visual inspection, basic metallurgy, photography, but they didn't have ground-penetrating radar. They didn't have modern explosive residue tests. They didn't have the sophisticated analysis tools that could now extract information from metal fragments, soil samples, and buried debris. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Goran Jorkdal received permission to conduct a modern forensic examination of the crash site. Using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, they searched the area where witnesses reported seeing the aircraft fall. and they found something the original investigators missed. Metal fragments embedded in trees surrounding the crash zone. Small pieces of metal driven into wood at high velocity. The kind of impacts that don't come from a plane hitting the ground. The kind that come from projectiles passing through the air. The researchers carefully extracted these fragments and sent them to laboratories for analysis. The results were striking. The metal composition and impact patterns were consistent with ammunition from aircraft weapons used in the early 1960s. Specifically, heavy machine gun rounds or cannon shells of the type mounted on fighter aircraft and armed trainers. This is physical evidence, found at the scene, showing that the Albertina was under fire. But physical evidence is only as good as the chain of custody and the ability to verify findings. Skeptics pointed out that the fragments were found 50 years after the crash. They could have come from other sources. The region had seen military activity over the decades. Other aircraft had flown over the area. The fragments might not be connected to the Albertina at all. So the researchers expanded their search. They documented every fragment found, noting exact positions, depth, trajectory angles. They searched for patterns that would connect the fragments specifically to the 1961 crash. And they found them. Fragments clustered in patterns radiating from the impact zone. Fragments at heights in trees that matched the altitude an aircraft would have been at during landing approach. Fragments whose trajectories all pointed back toward the same source position in the sky. This is the kind of evidence that's hard to explain away. It suggests that something, most likely another aircraft, was firing at the Albertina from a specific position as it approached Ndola. The fragments are physical proof of an attack. Combined with Julian's testimony, the witness reports, and Southall's intercepts, they form a compelling case for aerial combat rather than pilot error. But there's more evidence still buried at the crash site. The Albertina's wreckage was never fully excavated. Large sections of the aircraft remain underground, buried when the impact drove them into soft soil. These sections might contain bullet holes, impact damage, or other evidence of weapon strikes. Modern excavation and analysis could reveal this evidence. Attempts to conduct such an excavation have been repeatedly blocked. The Zambian government initially supported the idea, but pressure from other nations led to permits being denied. The official reason is environmental protection. The crash site is now within a nature preserve. The real reason, researchers suspect, is that certain governments don't want anyone digging up evidence that might prove their involvement in the attack. The soil itself could tell us things. Chemical analysis of Earth from the crash zone might reveal explosive residues different from standard aircraft fuel. This would indicate that explosions occurred involving materials not normally present on a civilian aircraft. Such residues would have degraded over 60 years, but modern forensic chemistry can detect vanishingly small quantities of explosive compounds. Tree ring analysis from the trees struck by fragments could even confirm the date of impact. Trees record trauma in their growth rings. If fragments entered trees in 1961, that event would be visible in the wood. This could conclusively prove the fragments are from the Hammarskjöld crash rather than some other incident. All of this evidence is available. The technology exists. The methodology is proven. What's lacking is permission. Permission to excavate fully. Permission to conduct comprehensive soil analysis. Permission to remove tree sections for laboratory examination. And that permission is being denied by authorities who claim to want the truth but seem afraid of what finding it might mean. There's another aspect of the physical evidence that deserves attention: the position of the wreckage. When the Albertina's flight path was reconstructed, investigators found it didn't quite match what you'd expect from a normal landing approach. The aircraft appears to have deviated from the standard approach corridor shortly before crashing. This deviation could indicate the pilots were trying to evade another aircraft, or that they'd lost control due to battle damage, or that they were attempting an emergency maneuver. The deviation is visible in the scatter pattern of the wreckage and in calculations based on where the aircraft was last in radio contact versus where it actually crashed. But the deviation wasn't emphasized in the original investigation because it contradicted the pilot error narrative. If Captain Hallenquist was simply descending too early, his flight path would have been straight and predictable. The deviation suggests something else happened, something that caused him to alter course in those final moments. Modern crash reconstruction techniques could analyze this more precisely. By mapping every piece of wreckage, every impact point, every fragment, investigators could create a three-dimensional model of the aircraft's final moments. This model would show exactly what happened, whether the plane was hit, where it was hit, how the damage affected its flight path. Such analysis has been proposed multiple times. Each time, it's been rejected or delayed or permitted only with restrictions that make meaningful conclusions impossible. The pattern is clear. Physical evidence that might definitively prove the aircraft was shot down is being actively prevented from examination. Meanwhile, the crash site slowly deteriorates. Tropical weather erodes the wreckage. Vegetation overgrows the area. Potential evidence is lost to time and nature. In another few decades, there might be nothing left to examine. The physical evidence will have degraded past the point where forensic analysis can extract useful information. This might be exactly what someone is waiting for. Let time do what active destruction would have made too obvious. Let nature erase the evidence while maintaining plausible deniability. Eventually, all that will remain are documents, and documents can be kept classified forever. But for now, in the soil of Zambia, beneath the trees where fragments are embedded, the truth about September 17, 1961 still exists in physical form. It's waiting to be properly excavated, analyzed, and understood. Waiting for someone with the authority and courage to allow a real forensic investigation. Waiting for the day when the desire to know the truth outweighs the desire to protect old secrets. Whether that day will come before the evidence is gone entirely remains to be seen. Time is running out, and for those who want the truth buried, that's probably just fine. 65 years have passed since Dag Hammarskjöld died. Everyone directly involved in his death is likely dead themselves. The Cold War that provided context for the conspiracy is over. The colonial system in Africa has ended. Katanga is part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The mining companies have new names and owners. So why does any of this still matter? It matters because lies have consequences that echo through generations. The lie about how Hammarskjöld died didn't just cover up a crime. It shaped the institution he led. It influenced how the United Nations operates to this day. And it set a precedent that powerful nations can eliminate threats to their interests without accountability. Look at what happened to the UN after Hammarskjöld. His successor, U Thant, was far more cautious. He didn't challenge great powers the way Hammarskjöld did. He didn't use the full authority of the Secretary General's office. And every Secretary General since has understood the implicit message. Push too hard against Western interests, and you might not survive. This is speculation, but it's speculation based on observable changes in how the UN operates. Hammarskjöld was actively creating a United Nations that could act independently of the Security Council's permanent members. He was building an institution with real power to prevent wars and protect weaker nations. After his death, that vision collapsed. Would the UN be different today if Hammarskjöld had lived? Would it have more authority to intervene in conflicts? Would it be more independent of great power politics? We can't know. But we can observe that his death marked the end of an era when the UN Secretary General could be a major independent force in world affairs. The Congo itself suffered immensely from the conspiracy. If Hammarskjöld had succeeded in reunifying the country in 1961, the subsequent history might have been very different. Instead, Katanga's secession continued until 1963. The country descended into chaos. Mobutu Sese Seko seized power in a CIA-backed coup in 1965 and ruled as a dictator for 3 decades. The Congo that could have developed under Hammarskjöld's vision, a united nation controlling its own resources, never materialized. Instead, foreign companies continued to extract wealth while ordinary Congolese remained impoverished. The country became a Cold War battleground. Millions died in subsequent conflicts. And the pattern of exploitation that Hammarskjöld fought against continues to this day. Would he have succeeded in changing this trajectory? Maybe not. But he deserved the chance to try. And the Congolese people deserved to see whether a different approach to independence and development might work. That possibility was eliminated on September 17, 1961. There's also the matter of justice. 16 people died when the Albertina crashed. Most were UN staff doing their jobs trying to make peace. They deserve to have their deaths properly investigated. Their families deserve to know the truth. Not the comfortable lie of pilot error, but the actual circumstances that led to their deaths. Harold Julian, the security officer who survived just long enough to testify, died trying to tell the truth. His testimony was ignored and suppressed. He deserves to have his words finally taken seriously, to have his sacrifice recognized. The witnesses on the ground who reported what they saw deserve acknowledgement that they were telling the truth all along. And there's the principle of accountability. If governments and corporations can conspire to assassinate a UN Secretary General and get away with it, what does that say about international law and justice? If such a crime can be committed and covered up for generations, what other crimes are being hidden? The continued classification of files related to this case is an ongoing scandal. We're not talking about recent events where source protection might be legitimate. We're talking about something that happened 65 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. The Cold War is over. The classified files serve no current intelligence purpose. They're being kept secret solely to avoid embarrassment and accountability. This matters because transparency and truth are foundational to democratic institutions. When governments can lie about major events and maintain those lies for generations, public trust erodes. People become cynical about official narratives. They start doubting everything they're told. And while some skepticism of authority is healthy, the widespread belief that governments routinely lie about major events undermines social cohesion. The Hammarskjöld case is also a precedent for how modern assassinations might be handled. The techniques used, making it look like an accident, controlling the investigation, classifying evidence, suppressing witnesses, could be replicated. In fact, they probably have been. The lesson learned from successfully covering up Hammarskjöld's murder is that such operations can work if managed properly. This is why truth commissions and historical accountability matter. Not to punish people long dead, but to establish that such actions will eventually be exposed and condemned. To create deterrence against future conspiracies. To show that while cover-ups might work temporarily, the truth has a way of emerging eventually. But in this case, the truth still hasn't fully emerged. And with each passing year, it becomes less likely that it ever will. Physical evidence deteriorates. Documents are destroyed. Witnesses die. Institutional memory fades. The window for full accountability is closing. Yet the pursuit continues. Researchers keep digging. Journalists keep writing. The UN keeps reluctantly reopening investigations. Because even if justice is impossible, you can't prosecute dead conspirators. Truth still has value. Historical truth, moral truth, the simple acknowledgement of what actually happened. Hammarskjöld himself understood the importance of truth. He wrote, "The road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action." He believed that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was the only path worth following. He died because he refused to compromise on principles. Because he believed the United Nations should serve justice rather than power. His death should mean something. It should be a turning point where the world said, "Never again will we allow a peacemaker to be murdered with impunity." Instead, it became a lesson in how power protects itself, how conspiracies can succeed, how truth can be buried for generations. But it doesn't have to stay buried. The files can still be declassified. The crash site can still be properly excavated. The truth can still emerge. Not in time for justice, perhaps. The guilty are dead. But in time for history. In time for the record to be corrected. In time for Hammarskjöld's vision to be properly honored. That's why this still matters. Not for the past, but for the future. For what we choose to do with the knowledge we've gained. For whether we demand truth and accountability, or whether we accept that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal. The choice is ours, and the world we build depends on which path we choose. We've journeyed through 65 years of evidence, conspiracy and cover-up. We've examined the witnesses, the suspects, the physical evidence, and the pattern of suppression. We've seen how every attempt to uncover the truth has been frustrated by classified files, convenient deaths, and official intransigence. So where does that leave us? The truth about Dag Hammarskjöld's death exists somewhere between absolute certainty and complete mystery. We know enough to be sure the official story is false. Pilot error doesn't explain Harold Julian's testimony. The witnesses who saw fire in the sky, the NSA intercepts of an attack, the metal fragments found in trees, or the decades-long cover-up. But we don't have courtroom proof. We don't have a confession from the killers. We don't have declassified orders authorizing the assassination. We have circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and a mountain of suspicious coincidences. Enough to build a compelling case, but not enough to prove it beyond all doubt. This might be the most sophisticated aspect of the conspiracy. The people behind it didn't try to hide all the evidence. That would have been impossible and suspicious. Instead, they hid just enough to prevent definitive conclusions while allowing enough to leak out to fuel investigation. The result is a mystery that can never quite be solved but never quite goes away. This serves multiple purposes. Keeps researchers busy chasing leads that go nowhere. It allows governments to claim they're cooperating while releasing nothing useful. It creates plausible deniability. We don't know exactly what happened, so we can't make accusations. And it ensures that anyone who speaks definitively about the case can be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. But the circumstantial evidence, taken as a whole, points in one direction. Hammarskjöld's aircraft was shot down by mercenary pilots, likely Jan van Rissegem or someone working with him. The attack was facilitated by intelligence provided by Western agencies, probably British MI6 and possibly the CIA. The operation was funded by mining companies who stood to lose billions if he succeeded. And the cover-up was coordinated across multiple governments to prevent diplomatic catastrophe. This isn't speculation. This is the conclusion that fits all the available evidence. Every piece we've examined, from Julian's testimony to the bullet hole in the playing card to the radio intercepts to the missing files, supports this narrative. The alternative explanations require believing in impossibly unlikely coincidences. Yet this conclusion will probably never be officially acknowledged. The governments involved will never admit their role. The files will remain classified until everyone who might be affected by their release is dead. By then, the truth will be a historical curiosity rather than a contemporary scandal. But the secret refuses to die. Each generation of researchers discovers the case anew. New evidence emerges from archives. New witnesses come forward. New forensic techniques become available. The truth keeps trying to break through, even though powerful forces keep pushing it back down. Why? Why does this case have such staying power? Partly because Hammarskjöld was an important figure whose death changed history. Partly because the evidence of conspiracy is so strong that it can't be completely ignored. But also because the case represents something larger. It represents the question of whether justice can be achieved when power wants to prevent it. The Hammarskjöld investigation has become a test. Can truth survive sustained institutional opposition? Can evidence overcome classification and cover-up? Can the determined efforts of researchers and journalists eventually break through walls of secrecy? So far, the answer has been almost but not quite.